In the last lecture, we covered the structure of argument, including the premises and the logical connection leading to a conclusion. In this lecture, we're going to delve further into logical fallacies or invalid logic, sometimes used innocently but often as part of motivated reasoning to get to a desired, even if invalid, conclusion. The first logical fallacy I'm going to discuss in this talk is the ad hominem logical fallacy, or to the person. This fallacy occurs when you attempt to counter the argument made by someone by focusing on the person making the argument rather than the argument itself. This is, in a way, the opposite of the argument from authority, which states that an argument the argument from authority states that an argument must be valid because of the positive attributes of the person making it. The ad hominem says the argument is rejected because of some negative attributes that that person has. As an example, people may often be accused of being closed-minded for not accepting a claim uncritically, especially if it's an extraordinary claim. This is a frequent counter-argument to skepticism, but really it is an ad hominem logical fallacy, saying that the objections are not valid or can be dismissed because the person making them is closed-minded. They're not open to the possibility that the claim that is being made is true. This is a non sequitur, a logical fallacy, because it has nothing to do with the objections themselves. In fact, being open does not manufacturing fake evidence, for example. I will note as a side note that insults alone are not an ad hominem logical fallacy. They may be ad hominem, but they're not a logical fallacy. It's only when the insult is used as the reason for being wrong. Also, saying that someone has made a misstatement of fact or committed a logical fallacy is itself not an ad hominem attack or statement, because those are addressing the argument itself and not the person. That's the key difference. A closely related logical fallacy is called poisoning the well. And here you're not necessarily addressing the person directly, but you're trying to taint their argument by tying it to something else that is unsavory or unpopular. A very classic example of this has its own name, called Godwin's Law, or a Godwin argument, named after the person who first pointed out how frequently this comes up. And that is to say that, well, Adolf Hitler believed the same thing as well. Therefore, it's tainted, it's wrong to believe in that claim. It should be pointed seem out of place, unusual, or apparently to conflict. That process is often called anomaly hunting, looking for things that don't seem quite right. They then go from not understanding the entire sequence of events to arguing for a specific conspiracy theory, that their specific pet conspiracy theory is the answer to why we can't explain every little detail of what happened. Despite the fact that there is often a lack of evidence, of positive evidence specifically for their conspiracy theory. They're basing it entirely on the argument from ignorance, the inability to explain every detail of what happened. Yet another logical fallacy is confusing currently unexplained with unexplainable. This often ties into the argument from ignorance. This assumes that our current knowledge represents the ultimate limits of our knowledge. This is often combined with anomaly hunting in order to make, as I said, the argument from ignorance, that therefore whatever pet theory you have or belief you have is therefore justified because we don't currently know something, therefore it's unknowable. This is often used also to support supernatural or paranormal beliefs. If we don't currently understand how something is happening, maybe that's because the explanation is outside of the natural world. It is supernatural. For example, we may see a fuzzy image on a photograph that if you look at it a certain way, pareidolia kicks in and it looks like it could be a human form or a face. And the inability to explain that is interpreted as it being unexplainable, and therefore it must be supernatural and maybe even specifically a ghost. History shows us, however, that many of the mysteries of the past are now solved by scientific inquiry. It's more practical, in fact, to assume that mysteries can be solved and then look for a solution. That assumption that the world is ultimately knowable has been working out quite well. Rather than to assume that they are unsolvable and then to insert a mystical belief into the gap. I'll give you an example of a personal discussion I got into with someone who was claiming that the Earth and the Sun, therefore, were only 1 million or so years old, not the billions of years old that scientists claim. And he cited the solar neutrino problem as an anomaly that could not be explained, that was unexplainable. Essentially, that there aren't as many neutrinos, a certain type of primary particle, coming from the sun as there should be if the sun were being heated by nuclear fusion of hydrogen into helium. This relative absence of neutrinos was called the solar neutrino problem. His argument was that, well, that's because the sun's not powered by nuclear fusion, it's powered by the kinetic energy of the sun collapsing, something which can only sustain the energy of the sun for millions of years, not billions of years. However, it was shortly after that the solar neutrino problem was in fact solved by scientists. Some neutrinos changed their form on the way to the Earth, and therefore we were measuring fewer neutrinos than the previous model had predicted. So this short-term ignorance or problem was rather rapidly solved. It was not an unsolvable problem. Another very common logical fallacy is the false dichotomy or false choice. This results from prematurely or artificially reducing the number of possible outcomes or possibilities down to just two, and then making the false choice between those two. If not A, then the answer must be B. But this ignores that, well, maybe C two ends of a continuum, two ends of a spectrum. There isn't pristine science on one end and complete pseudoscience on the other. There is everything in between. This collapsing a continuum into two extremes also comes up when people try to decide or define what the difference is between a cult versus a religion. That difference also lies on a continuum. Cults and religions may share a lot of features. There may be religions that have certain cultish aspects, and not every cult has every single feature of a cult. There is really just a continuum between these two extremes. This also comes up as another example in the true believer versus con artist. If somebody is making a claim that is not supported by science or evidence in order to sell a product, do they really believe their claims? Are they a true believer? Or are they completely lying? Are they simply a slick con artist? Oftentimes, the reality is somewhere in the middle. They may be cutting corners on the truth of their claims, but they may also believe in some aspects of it as well. There may be a more complicated combination of both of those features. This logical fallacy relates to the need for simplicity. We like to reduce the world down to just two choices, a binary choice, when in fact the world is much more complicated than that. The flip side to the false dichotomy logical fallacy is the false continuum. This denies the existence This is a method for denying a claim that someone does not wish to accept or believe in. For example, there are those who, even to this day, believe that the United States landing on the moon during the Apollo missions was a staged hoax, a grand conspiracy. They have, over the years, asked for photos from either orbiters or telescopes that show the landers on the moon and evidence of the artifacts that we left behind on the moon. However, when presented with these photos, they keep asking for higher and higher resolution photos. They're never satisfied with the photos that are available. Recently, NASA has made available very high-resolution photos that not only show the artifacts that the Apollo missions left behind on the moon, but also showed the foot tracks of the astronauts as they walked among the various locations. The evidence is stunning. Presented with this evidence, some moon landing hoax conspiracy theorists have claimed, well, these photos must have been faked by NASA in order to support their claims. So they keep moving the goalpost back so that no matter what evidence they're presented, is still not convincing enough. The reductio ad absurdum is interesting because it's actually a legitimate form of logic. It's not itself a logical fallacy. This form of argument says that if these premises are assumed to be true, then it necessarily follows or leads to an absurd and demonstrably false conclusion. So this is a legitimate way of demonstrating that an argument is not sound, because if the premises were true, it would necessarily lead to a false conclusion. Americans are on a large part of the world if the Great Wall of China didn't really exist. What would be necessary for fairies to not exist? Only that those people who believe in them are fooling themselves in some way, but there is no compelling evidence that would then need to be explained away. The slippery slope argument is similar to the false reductio ad absurdum in that it argues that if a position is accepted, then the most extreme version of that position must also be accepted or will inevitably occur. This is often used in political or persuasive arguments. For example, if we ban assault rifles, this will inevitably lead to banning sports or hunting weapons and will inevitably lead to imposing further restrictions on our rights. However, these types of arguments do not necessarily follow. It is possible to ban one type of weapons without going all the way to the final conclusion of banning all weapons or maybe even imposing further on rights. This argument has also been put forward as an argument against embryonic stem cells being used in research. The claim that I've personally heard is that, well, if we allow for women to donate their ovaries, for example, for embryonic stem cell research, that will inevitably lead to women being strapped down against their will and their ovaries forcibly harvested from them. effects of aspirin are a false analogy. There is also the false analogy logical fallacy, meaning that an argument may be dismissed as a false analogy, and a legitimate analogy may be dismissed as false because there are differences that are ultimately trivial. Of course, there's always differences between any two things that are compared through analogy. Otherwise, they would be exactly the same thing and not simply analogous. So pointing at incidental or trivial differences as if they invalidate the important or core feature that is being compared as a way of dismissing the analogy is itself a logical fallacy. The genetic fallacy is somewhat, I think, confusingly named because we've forgotten ironically, the semantic roots of the word genetic. We use that term now to refer to genes or inheritance, but it really does just mean the history that something has. The genetic fallacy, therefore, is assuming the historical use of something, a word, for example, that it must still be relevant to the current use, even when in fact it has changed. It has changed. So, for example, the term sunrise, the history of that word comes from the outdated notion that the sun literally was rising in the sky as opposed to the earth rotating on its axis. However, when I say that the sun rose this morning, that doesn't mean that I am supporting a geocentrist view of the universe. The historical roots of that word are no longer relevant to its current meaning. A straw man argument, one that I find is very, very common, is responding to an altered version of an opponent's argument rather than the actual position that they're taking. This is used to set up a version of the argument that is easy to knock down, a straw man. It's important to always understand an opponent's argument. In fact, when you have a disagreement with somebody, your first order of business should really be to truly understand where they are coming from, what their premises are, what their logic is, and what their position actually is. If you start to address or argue against a position that they don't actually hold, you will be committing the straw man logical fallacy. There is also what is called the fallacy, which is a very interesting one. And this is assuming that because an argument for a conclusion is unsound, that the conclusion must be false. I pointed out in the previous lecture, in fact, that this is not true. An argument can be unsound, logic invalid, but the conclusion itself still just happen to be true. That argument is no longer an argument for the conclusion, but the conclusion may still be true. So your work is not done. Just by pointing out that an argument is fallacious doesn't mean that you can therefore arrive at the conclusion that the conclusion is false. You have to come up with other reasons for concluding that. Armed with the knowledge of legitimate logic as well as all the various logical fallacies, the way in which our logic goes awry, I encourage you to go out and play a game I like to call Name That Logical Fallacy. When confronted with arguments, try to deconstruct the premises that are being used, the assumptions that are used, and the logic that is implied by the argument, and to see what is valid and what is not valid. But specifically, you need to apply that to your own arguments. That's somewhat harder to do. It's really fun to do it to other people's arguments, but you need to apply